Now that we've looked at some of the mechanisms or causes of evolution itself, mainly one of the main premises from Charles Darwin, natural selection, you might be asking yourself, well, this is all fine and dandy, but natural selection is just kind of genetics blended in within ecology, environmental aspects. But what about the big picture? Is there actually any evidence to support the overall theory of evolution? Because microevolution, small changes over time as a result of natural selection, shifts in genetic frequencies in populations is fine, and that's pretty understandable. But later on in some of the videos that follow over the next several days, we'll be looking at macroevolution, major changes, speciation, species dying out and new species forming. And where is, if we look at it on a large time scale, where is the evidence for this? So we just want to look quickly at some key pieces of evidence here, and then work with them later in class. So perhaps one of the biggest pieces of evidence and one of Darwin's foundations upon which he based his ideas is that of fossils. Now, if we think of fossils, I'm sure we know what they are. That when when organisms die, if we as scientists are lucky, those organisms can become buried in various sedimentary layers and mineralized into, and essentially either imprinted in or become part of the strata, part of the rock layer. And if we're lucky, they're composed intact, and that allows us to, although the soft tissue's gone from that organism, the hard bones are left over, and we can look at anatomical structures. So this guy, for example, here is, well, what do you think that's a fossil of? If you guessed horse, you're kind of right. This is actually a relative of a horse, a common ancestor of a horse. It's similar to a horse, we can see. It looks kind of like a horsey build, big, ugly horse head. Yet the hooves are different, the legs are slightly different, and size-wise, this guy is actually tiny. It's about the size of a large dog. So you can see how hopefully how this might be evidence for evolution, that although this is not a horse, it contains almost all the same physical characteristics and is not alive. And through dating, specifically radioactive dating, something we'll look at in later videos, we can actually measure, approximate the date of these fossils, about how old they are too. So we can see that this is an excellent piece of evidence to support evolution. Things that Darwin might have said, like, well, why aren't these organisms still here today? They died out. They no longer exist. Well, why? Hopefully we can see the parallels and the tie-ins to natural selection. Another one that is interesting, that puzzled Darwin as well, that we really have to use your noggin and think about, is geographic distribution. And just if you look at this map here, color-coded in red, all of Europe into a little bit of Asia, and Australia and New Zealand here are marked. Now, this is just a random example, a made-up example, if you will, but let's, even if we do create a fictitious organism, why are there two types of organisms? Let's say a certain type of squirrel, if you will. There are small flying squirrels that live in Europe, yet over off the coast of Southeast Asia and some parts of Australia, there are things called sugar gliders that look very much like squirrels, yet are not the same. How could two totally different species live in two totally different areas yet have so many similarities? And we'll look at that later on, something called, when we examine what's called divergent versus convergent evolution. And we can look anywhere in the world and find examples of these. Another great example also goes with fossils would be that of, why do we have some of the same fossils here on the coast of North America rather, as we do on the coast of northwestern Africa? Strange things. The rock layers are geologically speaking very similar, so there's a lot of data here in this geographic distribution that if we think about in other ways outside the box, we can see that they do support evolution as well. This is one of my favorites because this is kind of a crazy one. Homologous anatomy. Now we know what anatomy is. Those are physical structures, arms, legs, eyes, etc. And we've seen the prefix homo here to know that we're referencing from genetics, remember? Same. So same or similar physical structures. Now if we look at this picture here, the bottom in particular, although the top is another variation of that, a human, cat, whale, and a bat. Now, all four of these organisms are mammals. They're all warm-blooded. They all have body hair. They all nurse their young via mammary glands. Very, very similar. And you can see in their forelimbs what would be a human's arm and a cat's front legs, a whale's flippers, if you will, and a bat's wings. Although they're all very different in their design, you can see some striking similarities in that they all have the same types of bones. The radius is in a similar position, although different in shape. They have a radius bone. They have an ulna. They do have a humerus bone, an upper arm bone. And again, although the shape is different, they do have these similarities. So perhaps over long periods of time, these bones have evolved via essentially due to natural selection to fit in to the environment. Think about it. What do humans do with their forelimbs versus cats? Theirs are going to be a little bit different structurally to fit the function. Where in a bat you can see very elongated, thin, lighter bones, obviously good for flight, and these extended finger bones to spread the skin over the surface of the wing helps in flight. Where almost flattened, larger surface areas in the whale to aid in swimming. So you can see one big characteristic here: form, fits, function is huge. But again, perhaps at some point in time going back, all of these organisms shared a single or perhaps several common ancestors, which over these changes over long periods of time, and again, we're not talking 5 or 10 years, we're talking millions of years, each of these organisms has changed and evolved, or to use a favorite term from you students, adapted to fit their environment. So this is a great one, this homologous anatomy, and we can see this everywhere, all throughout the world, in a huge variety of organisms. And again, not only animals, we can see this in plants, in mushrooms, etc. Very, very interesting. A couple more really quickly. This one's kind of freaky: embryonic development. Now for this guy, you have to recall excuse me, what an embryo is. This is developing inside of the maternal organism. Recall that as you started out as one fertilized egg cell, you developed then into essentially a ball of cells that through mitotic division kept dividing, and cell specialization led to tissue development, and overall led to you. Now if we look at this, this is kind of crazy here. Starting at the top, going down in these 4 columns, each of these organisms is a large or fairly significant vertebrate organism. A lizard and a tortoise, both of these are reptiles, and a pig and a human. Both of these are mammals, but all 4 of them have a spinal cord, breathe via lungs, fairly large developed brains. And if you look at the ending product just before they're born, each of them is pretty ugly, but you can see some similarities, very, very similar here between the tortoise and the lizard. Even as adults, they're very closely related. And between the pig and the human, as much as we hate to admit it, a lot of similarities there, very closely related. So that's interesting in and of itself, but go back to earlier time periods of development, and actually if you go back to in the second area, you can see that they become much more similar. We can see that even in humans we had a post-anal tail. You can see indentations for development of the spinal cord. We can even see these small openings here, eye development in all of them. And in fact, if we go way back, notice that in each one of them, right here, right here, right here, and right here, they have what look like slits. These are pharyngeal slits. They actually develop in each of these organisms into the throat and the pharynx area. What's interesting, if we were to have an embryo of a developing fish, we would see that these slits actually develop into the back of the throat and gill slits. So I mean, this leads us to a very interesting assumption that all 4 of these organisms are actually fairly closely related. They share a lot of similarities because as they change or develop over time, they accumulate differences, but developmentally speaking, they are very, very similar, which again leads us to believe that perhaps they share a lot more in common than we think. They've evolved and changed over time. And with the final step, and by no means are all of these the only pieces of evidence, but the final one we want to look at is actually a supplement to this one, and really proves this idea of embryonic development, because it's a no. You can't argue this one, and we'll be looking at this molecular DNA similarities. Now, from your study of genetics and DNA, you know that DNA are the codes, instructions for development and physical characteristics. And we actually have the ability, if we were to compare bases, which we've done in DNA, of organisms, the more similar, or the more similarities they are in the A's, T's, C's, and G's, the more similar the organism is. And think about where this DNA comes from. It's passed down through lineages. What we mean is that you received your DNA from your parents. They received it from their parents, who received it from their parents, and so on and so on. So if we go back far enough and trace back the origins, go back over a long enough period of time, we share DNA, a lot of DNA, with many, many organisms. And we can actually, through gel electrophoresis, through DNA sequencing, which again we'll look at these in a class activity in a few moments or in a few days, we can see that the similarities between organisms is striking. Our DNA with other primates is very, very, very similar. 95 to 97% identical. Our differences, and as we go and look at other organisms, which again we'll be doing, the greater the differences in DNA, the greater the differences in physical appearance, and also in turn the greater the distance of, or sorry, the greater the time period in which these organisms have evolved. So we'll look at a lot of these concepts. This is just a quick overview of some evidence, and we actually, throughout the rest of this unit, we'll be looking at individual specific aspects of each one of these fossils, for example, upcoming this DNA molecular similarities you'll be doing in class. So we can put these ideas to the test to see, are they really evidence for evolution? Because the evidence and the truth is really out there. Thanks.